By the end of 1944, U.S. troops had recaptured most of the territory taken by the Japanese in 1941 and 1942. The invasion of Iwo Jima, which became an important objective in American plans to bring the Pacific Campaign to a conclusion, marked the first American landing on Japanese soil. How was it that Japan and the United States ever came to fight for that forsaken piece of real estate? What were the forces that had pushed these two countries toward this penultimate showdown? The governments of the United States and the Empire of Japan had expected to eventually clash in the Pacific. Both had been maturing plans for such a war for a long time. The crux of the matter was China. Both countries wanted to have a dominant position to exploit the resources of China and use it as a market. The war with Spain in 1890 had left the United States with a strong position, holding the Philippines, Guam, Wake, and other island possessions to protect its access to China's markets. Japan, which had only emerged as a strong power in 1905 when it defeated the Russian Empire in a limited war, had taken Korea, Formosa, and established a strong position from which to potentially dominate China.
The desire to maintain the open door policy with China was a driving factor in the United States obtaining possession of the Philippines, and the possession of the Philippines in turn gave us a place we had to defend, and it was this mission which drove the doctrine of the United States Navy and the Marine Corps between World War I and World War II.
The 1930s had seen greatly accelerated Japanese expansion. In fact, many people date the beginning of World War II to the Japanese seizure of Manchuria that began in 1931.
What happened is when the Japanese expanded, made Manchuria into Manchukuo in 1931, the United States refused to recognize this. However, it wasn't until 1940 that the U.S. did anything about it. It was diplomacy without any sanctions, economic, let alone military.
In 1940, the situation changed dramatically. The defeat of France by Nazi Germany allowed Japan to occupy both French Indochina and Thailand. This latest move threatened American bases in the Philippines and the British bastion at Singapore. President Roosevelt knew it was time to act. He ordered all of Japan's assets in the U.S. frozen and immediate sanctions imposed. The sale of steel and scrap metal were suspended, as were all shipments of oil. A Japanese withdrawal from both Indochina and China were demanded.
The idea is to impose an embargo on Japan, hopefully using the economic pressure to force the Japanese to withdraw from French Indochina. This is not a reasonable policy if you understand the problem the Japanese would have in saving face throughout Asia if they were to withdraw under the pressure of this economic embargo.
Rather than back down as the U.S. had hoped, the Japanese determined that they would seize the resources they needed to continue their expansion. Japan's principal aim was the conquest of the Dutch East Indies, Malaya, the Philippines, and Burma. Once these regions were taken, a defensive perimeter would be established stretching from the Kuriles Islands south through Wake, the Marianas, the Carolines, the Marshalls, and the Gilberts to Rabaul on New Britain. From Rabaul, the perimeter would extend westward to northwestern New Guinea and would encompass the Indies, Malaya, Thailand, and Burma. Japan believed that the Allies would wear themselves out in costly frontal assaults against the perimeter and would ultimately settle for a negotiated peace.
Like the French, who were unable to defend their overseas empire after being overrun and occupied by the Germans, the Netherlands have also been overrun and occupied by the Germans and are not in much of a situation to defend their overseas empire. The Japanese feel that this will be a fairly easy acquisition, just as French Indochina was. There's only one problem. and that is the lines of communications between the Dutch East Indies and Japan have to pass right by the Philippines, which are dominated by the United States. So if you're going to seize the Dutch East Indies and the oil that is available there, which is very critical to the continued operation of both the Japanese industrial plant and the Japanese military, they have to be able to bring about a situation where they can move through the Philippines without interference from the Americans.
To further show that he meant business, Roosevelt deployed the U.S. Pacific Fleet to Pearl Harbor, Hawaii early in 1940, where it would be closer to the strategic places America would need to defend in the event of war. Although conceived as a threat, the move instead presented the Japanese with an opportunity.
If they can neutralize the American Pacific Fleet, even for a period of time of no more than 6 months, that will allow them to complete their expansion in the Western Pacific Rim, to seize the Dutch East Indies, and to neutralize American resources in the Philippines. And of course then, the American people being a reasonable, rational people, we will then sit down and negotiate with the Japanese, who will be in a position of strength to resolve the outstanding issues in the Pacific.
Throughout their march to war, neither the United States nor Japan fully understood the consequences of their actions or the true capabilities of their opponent. The Americans believed that Japan was a backwards nation whose planes and ships were poor copies of foreign designs and whose soldiers, sailors, and airmen would be easy prey for the superior technology and manhood of the West. The Japanese saw it differently. Though they recognized the awesome industrial capacity of the United States, they saw America as a decadent civilization that would collapse when faced with the ferocity of Japan's mighty warriors.
What they're banking on is that war is essentially a spiritual exercise, courage and will to suffer. And that is supposed to be the Yankee playboy's weak suit. You know, once you have a mindset, it's difficult to change it.
It came to a crunch on December 7, 1941. American planning assumed an initial Japanese attack would fall on the Philippines. Army units there would dig in to hold the Bataan Peninsula until the mighty Pacific Fleet could sail to the rescue. But the Japanese had a plan too, which was revealed to the world on a lazy Sunday morning at Pearl Harbor.
There was this one group of airplanes came right over Honolulu. They dropped down to about 25 feet, right in the channel here towards a battleship. And Stanley Bukowski, who was one of my buddies, he was out there. He says, "Oh, let's go over there and watch them drop the dummy torpedoes." So him and I went over there. I said, "Well, I got first call for colors." He said, "I got sound colors here in about a couple of minutes." He said, "Oh, we'll make it, don't worry. We said, let them drop the first torpedoes and then we'll sound general quarters and colors." So we went over there, and then there was 5 of them. 2 headed, looked like they were headed for the Oklahoma, and 3 for the West Virginia. So when they dropped their torpedoes, and then the torpedoes hit, and they were about 25 feet above the water when they dropped the torpedoes, and then you could see the little wake coming towards the ship, and Stanley says, "Look now, watch them when they hit, they're going to go thump." That was the first mistake we made that morning. When those 3 torpedoes hit, it blew Stanley and I across the ship to the starboard side. We're 118 feet wide. We were covered with oil, didn't know what in the world to think. And Stanley says, "Them buggers are using live torpedoes, which are not supposed to." And then as they climbed, then we looked at the airplane. Then as they got over the ship, then we could see the 2 red balls, but we still didn't grasp they were Japanese. And finally, it could have been about a minute or 2 later, our first sergeant came up soaking wet because his office was on 3rd deck, see, on the port side. It blew him completely out of his office. And he come up there and says, "Get to your battle station." He says, "We're under attack by the Japs."
The 2 attack waves of Japanese aircraft, totaling about 380 some planes, had they launched one more strike, it's arguable that the Pacific War would have been prolonged perhaps as much as 8 to 10, maybe 12 months more. But Nagumo had accomplished his primary mission. He had disabled every American battleship that was in Pearl Harbor. He had inflicted widespread damage on Army and naval air forces, and he was willing to call that good enough. But the big break that the United States Pacific Fleet had was that all three of its carriers were out of port that day. So that was a huge stroke of luck, which paid enormous dividends within the next 6 months.
The devastating raid on Pearl Harbor, coupled with attacks on airfields in the Philippines, enabled Japan to seize the initiative in the Pacific. The weak Allied naval and air forces were smashed or brushed aside, and within weeks, Singapore and the Philippines fell, yielding hundreds of thousands of American, British, Australian, and Indian prisoners. The Dutch East Indies, Guam, and Wake were taken, and everywhere, the rising sun of Japan flew triumphantly. But the Japanese fell victim to their own success. Their spectacular victories, coupled with the surprising slap in the face from Jimmy Doolittle's daring raid on Tokyo, led to a modification of the initial plan. Japan would now reach further. Midway Island was to be invaded to neutralize Hawaii, and other forces would take the Solomon Islands and New Guinea to cut Australia's supply lines. If the Japanese could seize Midway Island, they would be in position to neutralize the American bases in Hawaii, and if the U.S. was forced to conduct the Pacific War from bases on the West Coast, it would be very hard to make a comeback.
It would have necessarily forced a prolongation of the war. I think it probably still would have been prolonged. I do not think that the public mood at that time would have fallen in line with the Japanese preference that we would have sued for peace in order to concentrate on Germany. But it certainly would have given Japan much, much more time to build up its defenses and make the road back through Tokyo longer and certainly bloodier.
Although the American fleet at Midway was heavily outnumbered, the U.S. possessed one invaluable advantage.
Admiral Nimitz's problem was considerably simplified in that Commander Rochefort's codebreakers were able to tell him not only when and where the Japanese were going to strike next, specifically at Midway at dawn on June 4th, and it also gave the composition of the Japanese strike force. So the amount and detail of information available to the U.S. Pacific Fleet was simply phenomenal, and Japan, by contrast, was operating largely in the blind.
Through a combination of surprise and some amazing luck, American dive bombers sunk 4 Japanese carriers, dealing the Imperial Navy a blow from which it would never fully recover. After Midway, the initiative passed the United States. Two months later, Marines of the 1st Division launched America's first offensive of World War II in the Solomon Islands. The Japanese had earlier begun construction of an airfield on Guadalcanal that would threaten Allied communications to Australia. Wishing to build on the success of Midway, the decision was made to counterattack. A desperate struggle followed.
The Japanese were determined that the American lodgment on Guadalcanal would not stand. In fact, if you understand the plight of the folks at Henderson Field, in a single day they could be bombed by Japanese aircraft, shelled by Japanese artillery, and bombarded with guns from Japanese capital ships, all in the space of a single day. And yet they did hold on to that airstrip, and having that air power on the scene was crucial.
The Japanese end up trying to fight an air supremacy battle over an American airfield. And when you have such an elite force in a highly vulnerable plane, that ain't a smart way to run a railroad.
Despite all the battles that came before and after Guadalcanal, that campaign was the one which really defined the way the war was going to go. America, with its enormous industrial capacity, could make good all of the materiel losses in the Guadalcanal campaign, which involved something over 20 ships, I believe. The losses in men were serious by American standards, but they also could be replaced largely in kind. That was not the case with the Japanese. They lost the cream of their naval aviation at Midway and Guadalcanal and simply never recovered it.
At the same time, Japanese attempts to take New Guinea and threaten Australia from the north were first stopped and then driven back. The campaigns to secure the Solomon Islands and New Guinea would not be completed until well into 1943, but there was no question that the tide had irrevocably turned. From the very outset of World War II, the grand strategy employed by the United States and the United Kingdom emphasized the defeat of Germany over that of Japan.
Well before Pearl Harbor, we were pretty sure we'd be involved in this war. We began strategic talks with Britain in secret almost a year before Pearl Harbor. And out of these consultations and planning efforts, it became clear that it was in America's interest to defend in the Pacific while we combined with Britain and other allies to defeat Germany first. And this ultimately became the basis for all American strategy in World War II.
However, by the latter part of 1943, American production had expanded to the point where it was possible to conduct major offensives in Europe and the Pacific at the same time. In the Pacific, Allied forces would advance from two directions. General MacArthur's South Pacific Theater Force would drive north from its hard-fought victory in New Guinea to take the Philippines, while Admiral Nimitz led his forces through the Central Pacific. The dual campaigns became possible when larger and faster carriers of the Essex class and lighter carriers of the Independence class joined the Pacific Fleet. A powerful collection of ships, the Fast Carrier Task Force was built around the brand new flat tops, which gave the Americans unparalleled flexibility to launch both offensive and defensive operations. The Central Pacific Drive got underway in November 1943, when Nimitz sent Army and Marine forces to the Gilbert Islands to seize bases from which to support subsequent jumps into the Marshalls. Macon, the Army objective, fell to the 27th Division after 4 days of hard fighting. Tarawa, where the 2nd Marine Division went ashore, provided a much stiffer test of American amphibious doctrine.
The expectation of the U.S. at this time, Tarawa is a postage stamp. We will surround it, we'll put a shell virtually wherever anybody can walk, and everybody will be killed there. This is the oldest story in warfare, how artillery will just kill everybody who's out there, and there's nothing to do but just occupy the terrain. Watch out, because you may twist your ankle, in some hole somewhere, but that's as much as you have to worry about. One point of fact, this enormous naval gunfire probably killed about 1/3 of the Japanese defenders. Problem is, what's good enough? Particularly when they all got automatic weapons. This is probably maybe the only invasion in World War II done by the U.S. that a real strong counterattack could have thrown the U.S. off the beaches. It was that bad.
Japanese fought tenaciously. There were somewhere in the area of about 6,000 Japanese on Tarawa. They all had weeks and months to prepare fighting positions, interlocking fields of fire, pillboxes, using a lot of concrete made with coral sand, which is a very good base for concrete. The only way you could deal with those defensive positions was one at a time.
These are the best Japanese troops the Marines or anybody in the Pacific faced from start to finish. These guys were formidable foes. And it's a good thing we met them that early, because we based our training and the dedication of firepower on future landings to that level, and the Japanese in any other landing never met that level. So we not only overwhelmed them, we double overwhelmed them by taking into account the best that we met at Tarawa and never meeting them again.
The experiences in the Gilberts revealed several shortcomings in U.S. amphibious doctrine, especially naval gunfire support, coordination of air support, and ship-to-shore communications. Amphibious techniques were refined and modified to some extent after the Gilberts, but radical changes were not forthcoming. The method of assault for the remainder of the Pacific War had been established. With the Gilberts secured, the U.S. next moved into the eastern and central Marshalls to seize Majuro and Kwajalein.
Kwajalein Atoll was really the last of what has become the popular impression of the tropical island being invaded by Marines. After that, large islands, much more complex islands, not just flat spits of coral sand were taken. So the war actually changed just as we were learning how to win it. This operation was short and bloody. The Marines knew what to expect, met the defenses in a way more sophisticated manner with their eyes open. Heavier bombardment and so forth. There were heavy casualties taken initially, but we captured a base almost as cheaply as you could in a contested landing at that point.
The relative ease with which Majuro and Kwajalein fell allowed Nimitz to accelerate his next advance by 2.5 months, and on February 17, Marine and Army units landed on the Anahuac Atoll in the Western Marshalls. At the same time, a carrier strike against Truk, considered Japan's key bastion in the Central Pacific, revealed the Japanese had virtually abandoned the naval base there. The decision was made to bypass Truk, a strategy later known as island hopping.
When the U.S. gets naval and air supremacy, why not bypass Japanese strong points? Simply ignore them. After all, this is a bastion out there which is isolated, and turn it into a Japanese owner-operator and financed Japanese prisoner of war camp. The Japanese themselves have to feed themselves. Most of their soldiers bypassed are essentially armed farmers by 1945.
The decision to bypass Truk left Nimitz with enough well-trained troops, many of them combat veterans, to deliver a sudden blow at the Marianas. Although the Marianas lacked protected anchorages, the major factor that influenced planners was the need for bases from which B-29s could bomb the Japanese homeland.
Almost everything that is going to be accomplished in the Pacific is either done for or by the air arms of both the Army and the Navy. It truly is an air war. The idea at the beginning of the war, 1942 and 1943, the generally accepted wisdom is that you cannot effectively operate beyond the range of land-based air. That's why they're fighting in Guadalcanal in late 42 and early 43. That's why the Marines will later on land at Tarawa, and that's what the fight in the Marianas is all about. It's all about air bases.
Preparations were long, arduous, and comprehensive. Many carrier attacks, many heavy bomber attacks on the airfields, basically destroyed the air capacity. Weeks before the landings was the famed Marianas Turkey Shoot, where the Navy really went in and swept the place, and the Japanese responded by sending their best carrier planes, albeit not their carriers, into harm's way, and hundreds were knocked down. It broke the back of the Japanese naval air arm in the Pacific. So this is a major turning point in the war in any case. It was by far, up to that point, the most complex landing operation. As complex as D-Day was handled over 40 miles of water. This was handled over several thousand miles of water. I mean, units were sent directly from the United States aboard ship, units were sent from Hawaii aboard ship, and they met there, and it all came together. This is the largest landing that had taken place in the Pacific by at least a 2-to-1 margin. By the time that the Army 27th Division had to be committed because of problems really coming off the beaches, it was 3 times more complex, 3 times larger than anything that happened in the Pacific up to that time. Everything that they learned from Tarawa and had perfected by Kwajalein was amply perfected, albeit on a much broader scale.
Army and Marine divisions landed on Saipan in the Marianas on June 15, 1944, to begin a bloody 3-week battle for control of the island.
Saipan was a much larger island. It had been under Japanese control for decades. It had mountain ranges, it had civilians, wide open fields, good vistas. It was more going to be a campaign than a quick hit and run, take them while you can operation like Tarawa was supposed to have been, and in fact Kwajalein turned out to be. It was as good as they could do at the time.
By mid-August, the Marianas Islands were firmly in American hands. Just 3 months later, B-29 bombers began to fly missions against the Japanese homeland from airstrips on Saipan. Forced to fly without proper fighter escort due to the extreme range, heavy losses were common during the early going. An advanced base for shorter-ranged fighters was essential, a base that would also provide an emergency landing field for crippled bombers returning from their raids on Japan. Iwo Jima, a tiny volcanic island that lay halfway between Tokyo and Saipan, was seen as an ideal location for such a base. The decision was made to take the island by amphibious assault.
Then we're dug in, and we stayed on that place for the next 5 days. Every day at dawn, we would get up and attack, I would hear from the captain that at dawn we're going to get up and we're going to attack. First there'd be an artillery barrage, and then we're going to go forward and just wipe these guys up. Well, the artillery barrage would come, and then we would get up out of our holes and go a few yards, and there'd be machine gun fire at us. We'd have to hit the deck and eventually go back to our holes because there was no way we could move. We were just pinned down. In fact, that next morning was about the worst time I ever had on Iwo, because the very next morning we were out for this attack, and we get pinned down, and we have a bunch of guys hit, and the corpsman would come up to take them out. The corpsman would get hit. And I remember we were just getting murderous fire from this line of hillocks just in front of us, murderous fire from machine guns from the Japanese. We were pinned down in our holes, we couldn't move. And remember, a corpsman came up to pull in one of the wounded, and the corpsman went to get him, and as he went to get him, he got shot through the arm, and his arm was just flopping around, like that, and he was knocked down, and of course he got up and ran. He got over to our holes, he got hit again, and we reached up and pulled him into our foxhole. And he had a great big hole in his arm. We put, at that time, we were supposed to put sulfa in, and then put on the dressing, I'd never given a shot of morphine, but he told us to open his kit, and get out some morphine and give it to him, so I did, And what saved us was fog. Fog came in, and I didn't mention that this area we were on was very hot. It's like Iwo's a volcanic island, And it was so hot that you could dig down only about a foot. Once you got down a foot, it was so hot you couldn't stand it. So you could dig a foxhole only about a foot. Fortunately, there were other holes there that the Japanese had made, and there were shell holes we could use for foxholes, and dig a foxhole in the bottom of that, So we were enough underground, it was be safe. But by evening, after a full day, it was cooled off enough you could dig down about another 6 inches. The good part of it was if you wanted to cook anything like a sea ration, all you had to do was punch a hole in the can so it wouldn't explode, and put it in this hot soil and it would cook. It was great. But anyway, the steam and the fog shielded things so we could get the wounded people out. But we were losing people. We lost about 5 or 6 people then, right that time, just that one supposed attack. We were stuck like that the next 4 or 5 days. They would bring up tanks, and the tanks would spray the whole area with, we would send another one of our guys who was experienced, a guy who had been in the Raiders. He was a corporal named Anthony. He would go get aboard the tanks and try to point out to the tankers just where he spotted the things that were firing at us, but they couldn't see them, and of course the Japanese would just go underground, and when the tanks were there, they have flat trajectory and they can't fire mortars, so unless you get a direct hit on the thing, you can't wipe it out. The Japanese would come right up as soon as the tanks had left and fire at us again. So we were stuck there for about 4 or 5 days, everything had just sort of ground to a halt. And then the 5th day, which was March 7th, I guess the 4th day, March 7th, I got word during the night that Colonel Pollock, who had the platoon on our right, who replaced the one that had been pulled out, you know, replaced. He was going to make a dawn attack by surprise and with no artillery bombardment, hope to catch the Japanese off guard. So we should jump off just before dawn, you know, just at first light, and move forward, and without a barrage, prepare time, and we would catch them. So we passed the word. We had to pass the word from foxhole to foxhole, and sure enough, at dawn we get up and we move out of our holes, you know, into this rough country just ahead of us, where all this heavy fire had been coming from. I'm moving with the guys, and we get to the very first line of hills, and one of the what happened was that one of our guys spotted a Japanese who was supposed to be a sentry, was sitting there asleep, you know, with his, just sitting there like this with his head in his lap. He was supposed to be watched. The other guys were all underground. Well, he shot this guy, and of course that that set off the alarm for the Japanese. So they all come running up out of their cave, you know, out of this big cave they were in. We figured out there were two embrasures. We figured this out pretty quick because there were Japanese coming out of both ends of the cave, and we were right amongst them. The remnants of the platoon were there, you know. And I was at the front end of I went back and forth between my two units, you know. We had two units ready fighting. We couldn't see each other, but we're very close together. And I remember Sisk, the big fella from Indiana, was in charge of one, and he was up hard by the cave, you know. And by that time, they had killed a lot of Japanese just outside the cave. They shot them and killed them with grenades. He was right up near the cave's opening, and he was throwing grenades into the cave, and one time a great big piece of what I know now was liver came out and just landed at my feet. And Sis said, we're really getting at it. We're really getting him now. It was a piece of Japanese liver. And then the flamethrower came up, and the flamethrower squirted the cave, and they all ran out the back end of it, you know. There was the other end of the cave, and I'd been there just a moment or two earlier. And there were just about 6 of us that were up at the other side of the cave, you know, up at the end of a draw, you know, just a gully. And we suddenly got a lot of fire from our left, you know, from the gully. And my men all went up to the edge of the gully, and grenades began to come at us, you know. They would hit the ground, and then it rolled down into the gully and explode. And our guys were throwing grenades down the other way at the Japanese, who were firing up at them from below and throwing the grenades back. We were pulling the pin, and we'd hold it for a couple of seconds, then roll it down or throw it, you know, so it would explode, not giving them time to throw it back. But they were shooting at us too. We were just getting a hell of a fire. And remember, Nick put his helmet up, and it came back with a big hole in it. And Frost, my other squad leader, he'd been a barman, and the Browning automatic rifle, he had a Browning automatic rifle that weighed about 20 pounds and gave semi-automatic fire. And he was up there as long as he could, you know. And I remember he backed off with this from this heavy fire, holding this bar. He said, "Christ Almighty," he said, "there's hundreds of them in there. Why can't they send a whole company instead of just a couple of squads?" And I said, "It's all we got, Frost, you know." Anyway, the captain, I was on the radio with him. I was telling him what was going on, and he says, "Can you use a half-track? Half-track's track vehicle that has a 75 millimeter." "Yes, send it up." So he sent it up, and boy, it steamed right up to the edge, you know, and it just is armored, and it was able to fire right down, point-blank fire at the Japanese, and we were really getting him. It took this couldn't have taken more than about 5 minutes total, you know, this firefight. But we got back on top. Once the half-track got there, we were able to come up, and our grenades were really getting him. The other thing that Sisk was doing, he was throwing grenades over the ridge, you know, so they would hit the Japanese as they came out of the cave and back. There must have been, I think about 50 or 60 Japanese that were killed outside the cave, and I don't know how many of them died in the cave because we never got inside. You know, I didn't get inside. Some of the guys did go inside and came out with a couple of swords and things, but I didn't go in the cave. I just had other things to do. But things got pretty quiet about that time. We'd had some casualties, and we had to evacuate the casualties, and it looked like we were on top of things. You know, the Japanese, all the Japanese we knew about were dead, and the cave was silenced, and we thought we were in pretty good shape. You know, we'd lost half a dozen people, but most of them wounded, not killed. And I was standing there talking about 50 feet from the cave with a couple of the guys. Suddenly there's tremendous noise like nothing I've ever heard before or since, you know, just the most god-awful noise you can imagine. And I turn around and I see this hillside where the cave was, you know, just rising up in the air, just going straight up, you know, and I thought, my God, you know, rocks and boulders, big boulders, and so then it starts to fall, you know, it goes out like a mushroom cloud and begins to fall, and so I hit the deck. There's nothing else to do. There's no place to hide. I just hit the deck, you know, and all this stuff began to land on my back, you know, and I thought, my God, I'm being buried here, so some of it hurt, you know. But I was lucky, again, because if I'd been a few feet farther out, the biggest rocks would have hit me. That explosion killed quite a few people. Were killed by the size of the biggest rocks, you know. We had to dig them out. But the people that were in closer, not too close to be blown up, but close enough, they got a lighter kind of rubble, you know. The big rocks had gone over my head. So I was only half buried, and when it all stopped, I could sort of force myself up, you know, and out. Remember, our radio had an aerial that was bent, you know, but it still worked. And I told the captain, I said, we've got to have stretcher bearers up here. We've got a bunch of people that need help right now. So the captain came forward with the whole headquarters company, you know. They all came up with stretchers, and they dug the people out and took them back, you know, the ones that were still alive. And meantime, I'd taken the people that the captain had told me. He said, be sure you make sure that the line is plugged, because sometimes when they do that, there's a counterattack. So I took what guys could still walk, you know, and we went up and made a line to the, in case any Japanese came through it, but none of them did. There was nobody left. They had to counterattack at that time. Anyway, I was kind of shook, you know, everybody was kind of shook. But, and I didn't mention that during this firefight, I had a hell of a time keeping in touch with the captain by radio, you know. I was just involved in the firefight, you know, trying to shoot and to make sure that, go back and forth, make sure I knew what was going on. And the idea of, you know, working this switch and talking to him was just difficult. He kept chewing me out, you know. You gotta keep on, tell me what's happening, you know. Don't forget to press the switch. So I tried to tell him, but anyway, we got things together after a while, and then we decided we would go forward and attack, you know, because we thought it was a good time to attack. We had a few people left, and what was left of the platoon next to us from the other battalion, they had lost heavily too, and they lost their platoon leader, so they were combined with my outfit into one outfit, you know. We would go forward the attack. So we go through this rough country for about 400 or 500 yards. Every so often be stopped by an occasional rifleman who would hit us, one time by a machine gun, but you know, there were not many of them, and it was open enough country that we could take them out, you know, one by one. And we got to, we made about 500 yards, the only gain we made during my whole time there. But it was really good, pretty good gain. And that brought us into some really rough country where we could see the ocean just beyond us, but we could see that it was dropped off. By this time it's nearly dark. So I told the captain what it was like, and he said, well, he said, you better find a place to dig in. So we decided to dig in just inside this area, you know, where we began to get some fire from up ahead. So we dug in because it was pretty close to dark. We wanted to dig in before dark. And we began to get some pretty heavy fire about that time from the area ahead. And I I lost two people that I really cared about a lot. One was Anthony, the old raider. I say old, he must have been 30, but he seemed old as hell to me. He was badly shot in the hip. I'd sent him out to make sure that there were no caves or snipers left behind the area we had just overrun. And he got shot by somebody doing that. His hip was laid open, and I never saw him again till he was taken out, and I never found out what happened to him. He came from Oklahoma. And then Sith, the guy that had done so well at the cave, was putting out wire just before dark, you know, and I heard a shot and then this terrible groan, you know, just a awful groan. I could see him crawling, and he got gut shot with a rifle bullet, you know. We got him evacuated, and some of the guys saw him in the hospital afterward, but I never did. He died about 2 months afterward of peritonitis in the hospital at Pearl. So sad, you know. But anyway, he was such a good Marine, you know. He was always out in front, always doing what had to be done, out putting up wire. He knew he could have been shot, but he just did it, you know. Somebody had to do it, and he wouldn't ask anybody else to do it. He did it himself. They were the best troops anybody could ever want to serve with.
Going to the Pacific is a little different situation. We would go back to Norfolk, Virginia, our home port in the States. We'd get a 15-day leave, and it took about 15 days to get from Norfolk to New Orleans. But getting back to the ship, I was now a swashbuckling, salty coxswain with 2 major battles under my belt. So arriving back at the ship, I approached my immediate officer, Lieutenant J.G., and half jest, half in earnest, what's the game plan now, Lube? I want to get some of this shore duty I've been hearing about. In fact, there's a certain lighthouse down there in New Orleans on Lake Pontchartrain. I'd dearly love to finish out my tour of duty at that lighthouse. Well, I said, forget it. He says, your experience, that's what we need. I said, oh man, I don't want to hear this. So next thing you know, I'm boarding same bunk, same landing craft, the whole 9 yards, and we now find ourselves going through the Panama Canal to Pearl Harbor, and from there would be Saipan, Tinian, the Admiralty, Tulagi, Marshall, all these places, and we're doing maneuver as if we didn't know what the heck we were doing. We're still doing extensive maneuvers in all these various areas of travel. And of course, we eventually wound up at Saipan, which by that time had been secured, but it was quite an experience just to see the aircraft coming back from raids on Japan. And that was an eye-opener, because standing on deck of the ship, you'd see these flying fortresses coming in, and you'd look up in all their splendor. And as you're gazing up at the sky, something odd would take place, for you'd see a hole, or you'd see the sky through the wing, or maybe through the fuselage. And you're saying to yourself, this can't be, you know? And you'd realize they had taken some serious flack. And actually, they were coming back on a wing and a prayer. But in any event, all this led up to eventually, with extensive maneuvers, bringing us up to February the 19th of 45 for the invasion of Iwo Jima. Now this one, it got a little hairy, because what had happened, I would have elements of the 4th Marine Division aboard to bring ashore. And once again, we functioned as a flagship there as well. And well, I think we had Commodore Flanagan on board, Navy Commodore, that would cause us to be a flagship. And on D-Day, I would find myself bringing 36 Marines ashore. And at Iwo Jima, it was a different terrain with the Mount Surabaki, and the beachhead was such that it just tapered off abruptly into the depths of the sea. Whereas it normally, as you recall, it was kind of a long, extensive sandbar type terrain. But the problem is that I probably went in out about midday on that one, and not 8 hours. And the problem was to find a place just to land the boat. to bring the boat in, because there was so much debris and wreckage and so forth and so on that it was just difficult just to find a place to land. Well, what had happened on this particular one, my first trip into the beach, I had these 36 men poised to hit the beach, and there were two Marine officers sitting on the engine hatch next to me. And as I went in, the 36 Marines, or actually the 30-something enlisted personnel, stormed the beach, and about the third to last man to leave the boat was carrying an awkward 30 caliber machine gun tripod mount, and in the excitement of everything or whatever, he lost his footing right in front of my lowered ramp. And now with all the troops out and my boat lightened, the waves were hitting the stern of my boat as I was trying to put in position to back away from the beach. And in so doing, as they're unloading, the waves were hitting the stern of my boat and cascading over the stern, and I was taking water into the belly of the boat. And so I was hesitating a little bit, waiting for these two Marine officers to get up and going out and join up with his charges. And for whatever reason, they just kept sitting there. So I realized, well, I can't sit around waiting on these guys. I could have ordered them out the boat, but that wasn't necessary. I mean, they knew what they were there for. But for whatever reason, they didn't move. Had they moved out like they should have, they could have grabbed that guy by the armpits and dragged him on out of harm's way. But I was forced to put my boat in reverse, full throttle, and in so doing, I was bucking the incoming seas, causing the water to really cascade over the stern, and by this time the water is building up at my feet. And I still got the two Marine officers on board. But I did manage to back away from that young man safely, and the last I saw of him, he was scrambling, going up the beach. But in pulling away with the water, when I put it in neutral, to clear the beach, when I put it in neutral, the water that had built up in the bilge had sloshed forward, dipping my bow just enough to where my motor mac had not fully got the ramp all the way up. And in so doing, the water just poured in through the opening of the ramp. And in so doing, the boat just went out from under me. And so now I got my three-man crew and myself, and I have these two Marine officers that I got to get them ashore some kind of way. But now the boat's gone. Well, in the heat of all this activity, a couple of my crewmen we were issued a .45 pistol for our personal protection, but we also issued Army Springfield rifles just in case something like this for hand-to-hand combat. And so a couple of them grabbed a couple of these rifles because we didn't know where we were going to be going the next half hour. And one of the guys grabbed what we call a ditty bag. It was like a sea bag, but it was something we made aboard ship for first aid gear. And so as we left my boat with water, up to our chest, it wasn't a very pretty sight. You had to be there. And as we get out of my boat and go into another boat like mine, they had tied up alongside, and they're going to try to tow me out of harm's way and perhaps put a pump into my boat and save me for another day. But unfortunately, with the boats tied side by side like that, he couldn't make headway. And instead, we're going in circles. And now the mortars are starting to fall dangerously close. And they had an officer aboard that landing craft, and he, in effect, ordered the coxswain to cut my boat loose. And because we couldn't make headway, which they did. And that was the last I ever saw my boat. But at this point, he had to hit the beach to get these two Marines ashore. And in so doing, the two Marines stepped out, and myself and my three-man crew kind of lingered behind, hoping to hitch a ride with one of my incoming landing craft or whatever. But at that point, the ensign ordered me and my crew ashore as well. And what it was, they had like an unwritten rule that if you lost your boat, this is really directed to we coxswains, to put a fear of God in us, don't lose that boat. Because if you do, you're going to have to report to the beachmaster for further assignment. Now, nobody wanted to fool around with the beachmaster in that group, because as soon as they hit the beach, the first thing they did was turn around and start giving directions to the incoming boats. So they standing there with their back to the enemy and on the front lines, as it were, and they had a high mortality rate, as you can well imagine. So I guess that's why they would tell we coxswains and our crew that if you lose the boat, you got to report to the beach master for further, further assignment. So anyway, we hit the beach, and it's kind of funny as I look back on it, because we had two or three Springfield rifles, a first aid kit, and no ammunition for the guns. And of course, the two Marines, they stepped ashore, and I don't know, that was the last I saw of them. But at that point, some fellow comes walking along with the garb, suggesting he was part of the beach party, and attempting to comply with my orders. I, in effect, asked him, I told him, say, look, I lost my boat. I got to report to the beach master. Where can I find him? I don't know. They've all been wiped out. I said, oh, man, that's all I wanted to hear. So I turned to my three-man crew. I said, man, let's try and work on getting a ride, back to the ship. And what we did, we went to the water's edge and were assisting some of the arriving landing craft, placing wounded on board. And finally, one of the boats came along that was another Coast Guard vessel in the fleet, and seeing my dilemma, he invited myself and my three-man crew to come aboard, and eventually, by hitchhiking from one ship to the other, I was able to get back to the Bayfield, but I didn't get back till about midnight, because unbeknownst to us, the whole convoy had left the area because of a notification of an air raid imminent coming out of Japan. So I didn't have a ship to go to. It was out at sea somewhere. And of course, they eventually came back, and as it was about midnight before I got back to the Bayfield. And at that point, I reported to my officer, what had happened. Of course, they'd given us up for lost. They didn't know what had happened to us. And so my lieutenant tells us, well, you got to go topside and report to the captain, what happened. I said, okay, fine. So I go up there, and he's up there on the bridge by himself, and leaning on the rail, watching the war in progress and everything. So I kid like I walk up to him and report that I'd lost the boat. He said, well, yeah, that's what I understand. He said, are you all right? Oh, yeah, I'm fine. What about your crew? I said, we're safe and sound. He said, well, that's all right. I just regret reporting the loss of this vital watercraft. I said, I'm very, upset about that. He said, well, don't worry about that, son. He said, we're going to probably lose some more for it. So he said, just go get some rest and be prepared to relieve other crews, and just carry on. Aye, sir. That was in February. And April, we did D-Day at Okinawa, and I was promoted to boatswain second class. So instead of winding up going in the brig, I got a promotion. And so it wasn't too bad after all.
Bleak, ominous dawn greeted the vast armada standing off the shores of Iwo Jima in February 1945. For 2 months, ships and planes of our fleet had constantly pounded this enemy stronghold, preparing it for invasion. Swinging off the transport decks, the 4th and 5th Divisions of the United States Marines headed for the beaches. Gaining a foothold on the black sand, they moved in, engaging in one of the most violent, savage battles in the history of the Corps. On the 5th day of battle, a small group of men from Combat Team 28 scaled the heights of Mount Suribachi and there planted the Stars and Stripes. Of the men who fought there, Admiral Nimitz said, among the Americans who served on Iwo Island, uncommon valor was a common virtue. A single photograph told this story. Born of battle, it fired the imagination of all America, for it expressed the unity, drive, and determination of the people, a symbol of American courage. Inspired by the wire photo, the noted sculptor Felix de Weldon, then serving in the Navy, began work immediately. He completed a small model within 48 hours after the photograph had reached the United States. The great moment was recorded in clay. But this was only the first of many models. The 176th anniversary of the Marine Corps signaled the unveiling of the historic incident carved from stone.
Almighty and eternal God, we invoke thy divine presence here among us, that we may dedicate this statue to the memory of men who have died for our country, and that we may rededicate our lives to the ideals and principles of our country and its freedoms, and consecrate our lives to its service, and to thee, our Lord. Amen.
For this statue, de Weldon was able to use living models. 3 of the men who had actually raised the flag, the others had given their lives for their country. This stone memorial stands at the entrance of the Marine Corps base at Quantico, Virginia. This was a great achievement, but de Weldon was not satisfied. Carefully, he measured his model. Inspired, he sought to give it a sweeping magnitude. He envisioned a monument which would preserve and encompass the spirit and thrill the heart of the nation. He visualized a gigantic memorial which would rise to majestic heights, commemorating forever the unsurpassed gallantry of the Marines and the Navy corpsmen who raised the flag. It would be the spirit of all Marines from Tripoli and Chapultepec, from Belleau Woods, and back across the Pacific from Wake Island to Japan. A memorial to the heroic gallantry of all our fighting men. One to leave no doubt in the minds of our enemies that we are determined to keep our freedoms. Here was a challenge. As the years passed, this towering memorial took on form and expression. The feel, the drive, the thrust and power of the smaller statue was achieved in one 64 times greater. The challenge was met. Now the heroic group was finished. Molded in plaster, it was ready to be cast in bronze. Authorized by the unanimous vote of Congress, this memorial is made possible by donations of the people, by former Marines, the fathers and mothers of our fallen comrades, friends of the Corps, and men of the Navy and Marine Corps themselves. It would be the spirit of all the people of the United States, a symbol of all America for all time. The 6 men who raised the flag were typical Americans. There are their faces. Private First Class Ira Hayes, USMC. Pharmacist Mate Second Class John Bradley, USN. Corporal Rene Gagnon, USMC. Sergeant Michael Strength, USMC. Private First Class Franklin Sousley, USMC. Corporal Harlan Block, USMC. An original American, a Pima Indian from the broad plains of Arizona, a student from the dairy lands of Wisconsin, a mill worker from the hills of New Hampshire, a son of Czechoslovakian immigrants, a professional Marine from the Allegheny Mountains of Pennsylvania, a war worker from the fertile tobacco lands of Kentucky, and a truck driver from the rich oil fields of southern Texas. The oldest was 25, the youngest 19. 5 were Marines, 1 a sailor. The great moment lives, an eternal shrine to valor. In this memorial lives again the courageous spirit which makes America great. In it is the relentless determination of the American people to defend democracy against those who would destroy it. This inspired monument is a tribute to the indomitable courage of our fighting men and a manifestation of their faith in America. This really happened, one of the most dramatic incidents of any war, vibrant, perpetuated in bronze in our nation's capital, enduring for posterity. This is you. And you. And you. Silent, yet it will speak. Speak a universal tongue of the past, the present, and for the future. A symbol of a great nation, a symbol of a great people. Uncommon valor, a common virtue.
Now, taking a minute from his busy acting career and his current dramatic characterization, here is Tyrone Power, Captain, U.S. Marine Corps Reserve.
Uncommon valor. It couldn't be said better. And I guess it can be said about all those in uniform who have fought to keep our country free. They've kept this flag flying all over the world. You might call it a badge of freedom, a bright light of hope to a threatened civilization. Yet we Americans too often forget the price we've paid for this heritage. We take our freedom for granted, forgetting the lives sacrificed, the wounds which will never heal, the endless toil of Americans everywhere to keep this flag flying. This is a job which will never be finished, work which must continue, if we are to maintain and keep this freedom. We must build a strong and impregnable America. Now, we all can't wear a uniform and fight when this freedom is challenged, but we can build a strong and determined America to stop those who would destroy this democracy. If you were given the opportunity to prove your faith in America, wouldn't you be glad to buy a share of the future? Well, you can. United States saving bonds are shares of freedom, shares in democracy, gilt-edged shares of the ideals and principles which make these United States what they are today and what they will be tomorrow. The determination to maintain this freedom by investing in it is a challenge to every American, young and old. Ask your banker, or your employer, or your teacher. I know they will be glad to help you work out a plan to save with savings bonds. Thank you very much. And don't forget, invest in your share of America today.
It was the largest plane of its era. Sleek, fast, revolutionary, the Boeing B-29 Super Fortress embodied the latest technology and the newest engines. Its wings held more fuel than a railroad tank car. Its engines burned hundreds of gallons of oil on an average mission. And inside its pressurized fuselage, the B-29 carried the latest avionics, the most advanced radar systems, and a unique targeting computer system for its defensive gun turrets. It was a technical marvel that had no peer in the air or even on Axis drawing boards. In the B-29 Super Fortress, American ingenuity had created the war's most awesome bomber.
It was considered the airplane. The difference between B-29s and all other aircraft such as B-24s, B-17s, and the others was the B-29 was much faster, carried a load of 10 tons, had a range of 3,000 miles, had remotely controlled guns that was computer operated, was pressurized. So even in the winter and at high altitudes, we were flying in summer flying clothes.
What a leap in technology it was. And because it was pressurized, there were several technologies that had to be developed to accommodate that. For example, you couldn't open the hatch and start firing the gun. So they had to create remote control gun sights. It could fly fast, it could fly high, and its range was something like 19 hours, an incredible amount of time for them. And they had developed tanks in the wings, tanks that they could put in the bomb bays, and they had to have a dedicated flight engineer running, actually computers. They were electromechanical computers. It was this enormous, beautiful, gleaming, streamlined plane, and it was state-of-the-art. It was just very exciting.
Designed as the replacement for the B-17 Flying Fortress, the B-29 combined virtual intercontinental range with a combat bomb load of over 10 tons, making it the deadliest strategic bomber built up to its day. From its remote-controlled turrets to its pressurized hull, the B-29 represented the best effort America's war industries produced during World War II. And that effort paid off. The B-29, more than any other weapon, helped shorten the war and saved thousands of American lives. And yet, despite the innovations found in its design, the state-of-the-art soon passed the B-29 by. And in only a few short years, the Superfortress was relegated to obsolescence as America entered the jet age.
The B-29, the baby that's just beginning to plaster Japan and promises to continue until Hirohito says, Uncle. Uncle Sam, excuse please.
The B-29's development began in 1939 when the Air Corps initiated a $5 million study for an ultra-long-range strategic bomber that would eventually replace the B-24 and B-17. The study concluded a plane with a range of at least 5,000 miles, capable of carrying a 2-ton bomb load at over 370 miles per hour, would be needed. The following year, 6 aviation corporations undertook initial design work to create an aircraft capable of meeting such extraordinary requirements. After scrutinizing the proposals, the Air Corps settled on Boeing's design as the best of the lot. With a contract in hand, work on a prototype started at once. Boeing explored many avenues with the B-29's original evolution. The lessons learned from the B-17 were quickly applied.
The B-29's roots actually date back to the B-17 and to some of Boeing's experimental bombers of the 1930s, including the B-19. And when the Air Corps approached Boeing and asked them to build basically a super strategic 4-engine bomber, they were really the only company in the United States that had the institutional experience to do this. The problem was when they looked at the specs that the Air Corps fragged out for them, they wanted a plane that went between 350 and 400 miles an hour, that could go at least 3,000 miles, carry a huge bomb load, have power turrets, that sort of thing. They realized that they were going to have to venture into some seriously uncharted engineering waters, and that made them very nervous, but nevertheless they pressed ahead with this revolutionary new aircraft.
And all of this came about off of paper. They did not build a handful of them and test fly them for a couple of 3 years to find out what did and did not work. They didn't have time.
Slowly, the B-29 took shape. Boeing designed modifications on the fly, and as pressure mounted to get the plane into combat, the pace of the project increased.
As you probably know, it was an airplane that was put on the fast track as far as design, production, and so on and so forth was concerned. They were built in 3 different locations, Washington and in Wichita, and the Bell Aircraft Company in Georgia built B-29s also.
When you start trying to incorporate a whole bunch of new things, you're creating an airplane that is it's an invitation to disaster. And the B-29 was just that. They're mating a whole lot of new and unique systems on a scale that a year or 2 before was unimaginable. The modified Davis wing. was a unique wing. Fowler flaps were not new, but having them that big was. The fuel transfer system in it was a plumber's nightmare. The fact that it was the first combat airplane built that was to be pressurized was unique. Just the size of the airplane was, it wasn't the first built that big, but it was the first built in quantity that was that big. The fire control system, remote control turrets, was the first of its kind.
The gunners weren't near the guns. They just had a gun sight that they would move. And there's a little lighted ring in the gun sight, and they would get that ring on the fighter plane or the target and pull the trigger. And the computer would compute the angle of fire using the altitude, temperature, all those factors.
The B-29 also had a radar bombing system installed, one of the first production aircraft to be equipped with one. Thanks to its complexity, the first production B-29s rolled out of the factory riddled with flaws. Curtis LeMay once quipped that the B-29 had as many bugs as the entomological department at the Smithsonian Institution. Some of those bugs plagued the Superfortress throughout its career.
The B-29 had 4 2,000 horsepower Wright engines and Wright Cyclone engines. And they did have quite a bit of trouble with the Wright engine. And it was not unusual for a plane to have engine trouble and have to abort a mission.
The engines overheated. It was a brand new engine. They were huge. They were 2,200 horsepower engines, 4 of them, and they overheated quickly and would catch on fire. And one fire in one engine wasn't such a big deal, but if you lost 2 engines on the same wing, then you had a problem.
It was just an engine that was asked to do things that that engine simply could not do. You could not run a duplexed 3350 at high power settings for long periods of time at high altitude. That it just wouldn't take it. And that's what the engine on a B-29 had to do. And they never solved it.
While hopes were high for the new B-29 bomber, the Army Air Corps hedged its bet. Should the Superfortress project fail, a backup bomber was needed. That backup was the consolidated B-32 Dominator. The Dominator looked like the B-24 Liberator's ugly half-brother. In fact, the B-32 design borrowed quite a bit from the B-24, though it had a single tail just like Consolidated's PB-4Y Privateer. While capable of carrying heavy loads, it was not a modern marvel like the B-29. Lacking many of the advanced systems and innovations, it never went into mass production. Indeed, by the time the Army Air Corps took delivery of the first production B-32, it was clear that the B-29 would be successful despite its teething troubles. The Superfort's success doomed the Dominator to the backwash of history. Ultimately, it equipped only 1 squadron of the 90th Bomb Group. The Dominator took part in the final weeks of the Pacific War, flying combat missions out of bases on Luzon. Bugs or not, the Army Air Force needed the B-29 in the Pacific. Without it, the strategic bombing of Japan would be impossible to undertake before 1945. With it, Japan's factories could come under aerial siege by the summer of 1944. Unfortunately, the planners and staff officers in the States failed to understand the operational problems that would soon face the first forward-deployed Superfortress groups, setting the stage for a nightmarish disaster. Deployed to the China-Burma-India Theater in 1944, the B-29 did not look like a war winner at first. A host of problems plagued superfortress operations in the CBI, destroying its effectiveness as an ultra-long-range heavy bomber.
The CBI was the lowest priority of any theater of war. There was a limited amount of supply that could be brought to the CBI in the first place, in through India, then up over the mountains by air into China. General Stilwell, the American theater commander, wanted to use it to build up the Chinese army. General Chennault, commanding the Air Force in China, wanted to use it to build bases and supply B-29s for bombing of Japan. It was the first place we could reach Japan from with B-29s. Chennault won the argument, and the bulk of the supplies over the hump route were devoted to B-29s.
The unfortunate part of that whole situation was it was such a long trip. Our missions could range up to 20 hours, and that is a very, very long time to fly across the ocean to get to a place like Singapore, and then come under attack there, and then try to get back to your base in India. It was very difficult. We did stage out of another island at one or two times, but no matter what, the missions were 18 hours long. The shorter missions were missions to Rangoon. They were considerably shorter and considered a milk run. Obviously, the targets like Singapore and those were very well defended, and you had to put up not only their anti-aircraft defenses, but the fighter attacks. And it was, if you had a problem or if you had damage or lost an engine or something, the chances of you returning to your base were slim.
Working under the most primitive of conditions in blazing heat, just keeping the B-29s running was a challenge.
Well, the B-29 had its trials because it was depending on so much new technology. It hit the airfields without a lot of testing. The goal was to get it over the target as soon as possible. So those early crews battled a lot of problems with the planes themselves.
We arrived there, I would say, about the 1st of December, when the best weather was, and the monsoons were not, all the time that I was in India, the weather was just really quite nice in comparison to those guys that had been there since March or April of 1944. As I mentioned to you, they had problems with the engines overheating on takeoffs during that hot weather. The engines were conking out, getting too hot on takeoff, you know. But when I arrived there, the weather was quite nice. I couldn't complain about it at all.
To prepare for the arrival of the B-29s in China, the 14th hired thousands of Chinese coolies to build the huge runways the new bombers required.
The Chinese government, in conjunction with the Americans, built 6 huge bases that would accommodate B-29s in Western China. But they were only about 60 miles from the Japanese lines, which just meant they were incredibly vulnerable, and that 60 miles could change to nothing in short order. The Chinese did an amazing thing in constructing these airfields, primarily because there was no heavy equipment to do it. And they did it in what I understand is a pretty short period of time, and they did it all by hand. They crushed rocks with little hammers. And the way they did it was bringing in thousands and thousands of laborers to do this work.
Using primitive hand tools, the dedicated Chinese completed the fields by the spring of 1944, in time for the arrival of the first B-29 groups. the start, flying missions from these new Chinese bases devolved into a nightmare.
They called the Himalayas the hump. The Himalayas were a formidable obstacle, the tallest mountain range in the world, and there was the weather over them was horrendous. I mean, it was the kind of weather that knocks planes out of the sky, and so it was hazardous enough that they eventually gave Himalaya hump missions mission credit. It was as if it was as dangerous. It was deemed as dangerous as flying a combat mission.
Through the fall of 1944, the superforts launched attacks on Japanese targets in China, plus on southern Japan itself. Each raid represented a tremendous logistical effort that these small pinprick raids failed to justify. Operations in China could not be sustained, and the few B-29s the 14th could put over any given target could not inflict lasting damage on the Japanese. Although the first raid on Japan took place in June of 1944, the Japanese failed to understand the potential threat to their homeland. Since these early CBI-based raids did little damage, they imbued a sense of overconfidence in Japan's home defense units. With expectations riding high for the superforts to help shorten the war, the early operations in the CBI bitterly disappointed the senior Army Air Corps brass. Fortunately, another series of bases became available that summer that would ultimately invigorate the strategic bombing campaign against Japan. In June of 1944, American Marines and infantry stormed the beaches of Saipan, a key Japanese possession in the Mariana Island chain. Weeks of intense fighting followed as the Americans wiped out the Japanese defenders, some of whom resorted to desperate banzai charges when all looked lost. Even before the ground troops secured the island, combat engineers worked to build the gigantic airfields needed to support B-29 operations. From Saipan, the superforts could bomb Tokyo. Later that summer, American troops assaulted Tinian, an island within artillery range of Saipan. Tinian's flat, hard ground was tailor-made for B-29 bases, and soon engineers had transformed the island into one big airfield complex.
In October of 1944, it was the plan for the first B-29s to start bombing Japan from the Pacific Theater. And the first of these B-29s were sent over to Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, which were islands that made up the Mariana Islands.
As the first groups arrived in the Marianas, the B-29 men discovered their new home could be a dangerous place.
They were strafing us, and boy, we cleared out of that Quonset hut in a hurry, everybody running in different directions looking for a foxhole or some kind of cover. The first time, we didn't have any place to go. And I remember one of my buddies there jumping into a trash can, for example. It was not a great place to be when you're being strafed.
In October 1944, the new B-29 groups launched their first attack on the Japanese mainland.
They wanted to have 200 planes before they would, we would be sent on the first mission. I think we took off somewhere around, maybe around midnight. We got there, we were very much of a surprise to the Japanese. They were not ready. I kind of have recollections of listening to Japanese music on some earphones as we approached Japan, and as we started in over the beach, the coastal area, suddenly the music all went off. And I think it must have been somewhere at that point that they discovered they were being bombed by large bombers.
While the first missions flown from the Marianas caught the Japanese by surprise, their fighter and flak defenses quickly awoke to the new danger. Through the rest of 1944, the B-29 crews encountered stout opposition.
Zeros, Zeeks, and other planes were ramming us, flying into the side of our planes and hitting us and knocking us down.
Fierce opposition, grueling 14-hour missions, and no safe haven for emergency landings between Saipan and the Imperial homeland hampered B-29 missions throughout the rest of the year.
What happens over Japan is the Air Force finds out very quickly that what had worked in Europe, its doctrinal high-altitude daylight precision bombing campaign, isn't going to work in Japan because of the prevailing weather conditions they're encountering.
As the bombing campaign against Japan wore on with little results, doubts about the entire B-29 program arose in Washington. The problem was not the plane, however. The problem was the jet stream over Japan.
There are portions of the world that have high-altitude winds that nobody knew about until the advent of high-altitude bombing. Well, these winds did not exist over Europe. Europe's weather comes out of the North Sea, and it's just spun off like the spokes of a bicycle. But none of the high-altitude phenomena there were unexpected. They were known, and they knew how to deal with them. They never did learn how to deal with the clouds over Europe, but they knew they were there, and they knew why they were there. The weather over Japan comes out of Siberia and the Gobi Desert. Well, nobody had weather stations there. Nobody knew what went on 30,000 feet over Japan. Well, what went on there was what came to be known as the jet stream. And it could be as much as 200 or 300 miles an hour. That was a relative rarity, but the jet stream itself was almost a constant. At anywhere from 70 or 80 miles an hour to 150 miles an hour was relatively common. Well, if you've got an airplane that's traveling 250 miles an hour flying into 150 mile an hour headwind, your bomb sight is not capable of handling that much of a wind drift, whether you're going into it sideways or downwind. The Norden bomb sight couldn't handle 100 mile an hour crosswind, headwind, or tailwind. So when they dropped bombs, God only knew where they were going to go.
In February 1945, the situation came to a head during a raid on Tokyo.
That was a high altitude strike, and I think we were trying to hit an aircraft factory. And I think our results were quite unsatisfactory. We missed the target. The conditions for bombing were terrible. For one thing, the 20th Air Force discovered the jet stream. We'd run into 200-knot winds at 30,000 feet. And this made precision bombing from high altitude extremely difficult.
The 20th needed to find a way around the jet stream, or face the stark fact that its high-altitude precision bombing campaign would be derailed by this freshly discovered force of nature.
We tried bombing at a little lower altitude, 20,000 feet, and that didn't turn out to be much more satisfactory.
As the 20th struggled with the jet stream problem, the Superfort crews struggled with the Pacific's geography. Flying 1,600-mile missions never became routine. Every flight, every sortie ran the risk of ditching in the cruel Pacific Ocean hundreds of miles behind enemy lines. To rescue these men, the Navy provided submarines to act as plane guards, whose job it was to rescue downed aircrew.
It was a long way home for the B-29s returning from a strike on Japan. Many of them were damaged by anti-aircraft or sometimes by fighters. It was hard sometimes for them to get all the way back to their bases, and to help them out, the U.S. Navy established a string of submarine positions in the ocean. These submarines would stay in one location, and these locations were known to the B-29 crews. If they couldn't make it back to base, they would do their best to crash land in the ocean next to one of the submarine positions so the crews could quickly be rescued.
Ditching an airplane is quite an art. You never get to do it, you just have to do it. When I was finally rescued, it was a day that the ocean was as calm as I'd ever seen it. Not real calm, but calm. And I was there not paying attention to anything, and I heard probably the most god-awful noise I've ever heard in my life. Hissing and bang and everything. And out of the boat. I was thrown out of the boat, and I was completely by surprise because the ocean wasn't going to throw me out. And I looked over my raft, and here's this huge hunk of metal. And I said to myself, I don't care if it's Japanese, American, whoever, just take me, I'm through. Well, luckily for me, a little dinghy gets in the water, and here come a couple American sailors paddling out to me, and they get me and tow my boat in. I'm going to tell you, one of the most fantastic days of my life occurred then when I was taken aboard the ship.
If the air campaign against Japan was to ever get on track, the B-29 wings would need to employ innovative tactics to compensate for the forces of nature they faced on every mission. Washington recognized that, and in the early months of 1945, the Army Air Corps sent its best bomber leader to the Pacific to take care of the situation. Enter General Curtis LeMay.
Hap Arnold had put all this money into a bomber, and that bomber was going to work. He didn't know how, but it was going to work. And he was going to find somebody that would make it work.
General Curtis LeMay arrived to take over the bombing campaign in early 1945. Almost at once, he recognized the futility of high-altitude precision bombing. A veteran of the famed Regensburg raid of 1943 over Germany, LeMay had always been an outspoken advocate of strategic pinpoint bombing. Now faced with a situation where all the training and tactics he believed in were failing, he moved quickly to adapt.
General LeMay determines that in order to accomplish his mission, he will approach destruction of the Japanese war industries by carrying out a low-level, nighttime incendiary campaign against those cities. And this represents a major policy shift, and he does this without permission from Washington.
No longer would the B-29s go in high and aim at select targets. Instead, LeMay ordered his men to go in low at night. Tokyo would be their first target using these new tactics. The change shocked his airmen.
When the operations officer said, you know, that the target is going to be Tokyo, the bombing altitude will be 8,000 feet. When he said that, there was just a gasp that went up. Oh. And rumors were swirling around, you know, about how LeMay expects to have 50% of the plane shot down.
Those who survived the attack never forgot the carnival of the macabre that unfolded around them that night over Tokyo.
The fires were really going by the time we got over the target.
The low-altitude night raid against Tokyo devastated the Japanese capital.
This first raid against Tokyo is very successful. It virtually wipes out the entire downtown area, probably kills somewhere around 40,000 people and leaves over 1 million homeless, but it's very effective in attacking the kind of cottage war industries that Japan has at this point. Based on that success, General LeMay will order further incendiary raids. Now down the road, as they continue these, there'll be a shortage of incendiary bombs, which will force the Air Force to go to a combination of daylight regular bombing raids and nighttime incendiary raids in tandem, working together in an attempt to destroy Japanese industry.
Japanese pilots defended their cities with every ounce of skill and courage they possessed.
We were dropping bombs on their homes. Tokyo was where they lived, and they were young guys that wanted to defend themselves and their homes and their families, just like we would if we were up over San Francisco or some other local city. You know, we would be pretty upset with whoever the enemy was.
The Japanese fought back fiercely, at times ramming the B-29s with their own fighters.
They were almost ready to go into kamikaze when all this was happening, and they did a couple times. At night, they tried to make a move on us and at night ram us.
As we were watching a lot of our buddies in the other B-29s next to us that were dropping their bombs and incendiaries, getting knocked down because they were getting hit, and we lost a lot of our fellow B-29s.
Daytime or night, anti-aircraft fire remained an ever-present danger.
Every searchlight in Nagoya and every flak gun in Nagoya was on us. We were just bathed in light, and there's this wall of flak out in front of us.
The nighttime attacks took an emotional toll on the airmen as fighters would stalk them, flak would claw them out of the sky, but their buddies would never know what happened to those who didn't return the following morning.
When we lost somebody, we never knew what happened to them because it was at night, we were flying individually, radio silence, they just didn't come back.
And you always wonder whatever happened to those guys, you know.
Through the spring of 1945, the 20th burned Japan's major cities to the ground.
These raids are extremely effective, but they're also very destructive. Anywhere from 80 to 95 or more % of all the major cities of Japan are destroyed during these attacks.
You know, here we've been trained for high-altitude precision bombing. We're knocking out a war industry. And here, all of a sudden, we're burning down cities. And this guy says that we have to burn these cities down because the way the Japanese operate, the way their war industry operates, is that they do all kinds of piecework all over the city in their homes. And every morning or every evening, trucks go by and pick up these parts and take them to the factories where they are assembled. And the only way we can knock out their industry is to knock out the whole city. I don't know whether that's true or not, but that's what we were told.
As their cities died, Japan's war effort collapsed.
The B-29 effort, involving the largest, most advanced plane in the world, thousands of tons of bombs dropped on Japanese cities, is often given credit for having ended the war, destroyed Japanese industry, strangled the Japanese economy. In fact, the lion's share of the credit probably should go to the American submarine fleet that sank most Japanese merchant shipping, so that by the end of the war, very, very little in the way of raw materials or food were getting into the home islands, and Japanese industry had basically ground to a halt.
It was a gruesome campaign. Hundreds of thousands of men, women, and children died in the flames. Though the B-29 is remembered as the torch that set Japan afire, superforts took part in many other missions. As the war wound down, they were used to mine the last operating Japanese harbors. These mines destroyed dozens of ships and closed most of Japan's remaining ports. The few merchant ships that had evaded the deadly American submarine wolf packs through 1945 now discovered they had no safe havens at all. At the same time, B-29 squadrons launched leaflet raids over the imperial homeland and areas in Southeast Asia still under occupation. Over Japan proper, these leaflets warned civilians to leave their cities, for they were about to be firebombed. In the occupation areas, such as Burma, the leaflets dropped promised Japanese troops that they would be well fed and treated if they surrendered. Though these primitive psychological campaigns had little seeming effect, they did offer the air crews a break from all the tension and terror of the firebombing raids. As the bombing continued, the capture of Iwo Jima finally gave the B-29 crews a safe haven between Japan and the Marianas.
There were many crippled planes that would not have made it back to their bases in the Marianas, and they needed a short stop, a place where they could just make it to Iwo and get down and get repaired, and they could make it on. The other thing that happened, though, is that now they were close enough to the homeland of Japan that fighters could go with them as cover. So this was a huge benefit, and they called them the Little Friends.
Even before the island was totally secured by the Marines, crippled superforts began making emergency landings there.
Oh, we got shot up on a number of missions. Had engines hit, and on one return we were coming back to, we got shot up, engines shot up rather badly over Tokyo, daytime mission, and the pilot told us that there's a good chance that we were not going to get back and might have to go into the ocean. And we were getting close to Iwo Jima, which had pretty well been taken now by the Marines. However, not completely. There was still a portion of Iwo Jima that was still at war.
Many B-29 crews were not lucky enough to reach Iwo, let alone the desolate stretches of the Pacific Ocean. They fell into the hands of the Japanese.
As a matter of fact, what they told us, if there was any way whatsoever, is to get out and over the ocean, do it, and bail out over the ocean. We all had Mae West, and we all had dinghies. And if the airplane ditched and it was successful, it had a big dinghy up over the bomb bays.
B-29 crews who got shot down over Japan faced a unique situation. Over in Europe, the heavy bomber crews who got shot down over Europe had a chance of linking up with resistance elements. They looked European, so they could escape and evade, and it was done. But even if they were captured, they were basically taken to prisoner of war camps and treated humanely. In Japan, that wasn't the case.
Of all Americans who were captured by the Japanese, about 40% died. The B-29 crews were called special prisoners. They were given a designation and were treated separately. And my understanding is that about 5% of those survived. All of them had, starvation issues. All of them had been brutally beaten. All of them had been forced labor and held in, terrible, filthy conditions. At the very end of the war, many of the prison camps that held B-29ers, some of the Japanese guards executed them.
By August, the B-29 raids had devastated 66 cities, laying waste to some 178 square miles of densely populated urban areas. According to Japanese sources, the raids killed 241,000 people, while injuring another 313,000. The destruction left almost 9 million people homeless. At the same time, the attacks ruined the Japanese economy. But it would take 2 more nightmarish missions to bring Japan's leaders to the surrender table.
Gentlemen, we met at Wendover for the first time about 10 months ago. I told you at that time that I had great hopes that the mission that we were about to undertake could end the war. At the same time, I offered to release any man who felt that he could not work under the conditions of mystery and possible danger that might prevail. That offer still goes, because tomorrow we're going to execute that mission.
Until the first atomic mission took off, the only people who had been told exactly what they were doing were those that needed to know. Deke Parsons, his armorers, Tibbets. There were a handful in the group that knew what they were doing in detail. Having said that, a lot of these guys figured out on their own and didn't dare say anything that they were working with a nuclear weapon. At their briefing before takeoff, the crew was told
all of that because this bomb that you're going to use is not an ordinary bomb. It's not a 1,000-pounder. It's not a 10-ton blockbuster. This bomb has the strength of 20,000 tons of TNT.
On August 6, 1945, a B-29 called the Enola Gay dropped the world's first atomic bomb. The city of Hiroshima was incinerated in a millisecond of fiery horror. Tens of thousands died instantly. Others suffered for weeks before succumbing to radiation poisoning. The Japanese military tried to convince the emperor that this new weapon was simply a flash bomb whose effects could be mitigated by wearing white clothing. The emperor was not convinced. After the second atomic bombing, this one in Nagasaki, he ordered the government to make peace. Chaos followed, and an aborted coup nearly upset the government's effort to surrender. Finally, the emperor himself addressed the nation and told his subjects that they had to endure the unendurable and accept unconditional surrender. World War II had at last come to an end. The B-29 superfortress, with all its terrible capacity for destruction, had played a significant role in bringing about the peace. For the superfortress crews, the surrender gave them time to reflect on their accomplishments. Many were torn by their experiences, proud of their devotion to duty, but uncomfortable with the gruesome effect their B-29s had on the Japanese people.
At the time, I was just, damn glad that things were over with, because it was probably, it might have meant a lot of more deaths and loss of life. But at the same time, I was kind of wondering and wishing they might have dropped those bombs not right on a city, but maybe in a nearby bay or someplace where they could demonstrate to the Japanese what these things could do, rather than just straight out on a city. That as one individual viewpoint, bothered me.
One thing about the Air Force that's different from the infantry is that it's very impersonal. You're not, when you're shooting at a fighter, you're shooting at another airplane, they're not shooting at a pilot. And you're not bombing people, you're bombing cities. It's not like you're seeing a guy in front of you and you're shooting like it is in the infantry. I'm not saying that I don't think it was the way to go in the war, because I think that the Japanese were willing to pay a terrific price before they surrendered, and they did pay it. I mean, we had to root them out somehow.
After the war, the B-29 formed the core of America's atomic deterrent at the dawn of the Cold War. Yet even as in 1945 it represented the pinnacle of American aviation technology, the B-29 soon became a relic of an older age. Eclipsed by sleek jet bombers like the B-47 Stratojet, the Superfortress sank into obsolescence. By 1950, the B-29 was considered a medium bomber by the Air Force. Employed during the Korean War to firebomb North Korea's major cities, the Superfortress soldiered on.
The Namsu raid was a turning point in the Korean War. Basically what happened was the North Koreans began building hard runways, concrete runways, in the southern part of North Korea in an attempt to project power, their MiG-15 air superiority aircraft, into the 38th parallel. That, as far as the UN forces were concerned, couldn't be allowed to happen. So they sent in B-29 strikes to destroy these airfields before they were constructed, and they did it during daylight. Well, one particular raid at the end of October 1951 was intercepted by a hand-picked wing of Soviet MiG-15 pilots, and they savaged the formation. Of the 9 B-29s that started on the raid, 1 aborted. The other 8 got over into the general target area before they were bounced. Several of them were shot down. All of them were badly shot up, and many of the crews were killed or wounded. This really was the death knell of B-29 operations in daylight hours in Korea. After this, the B-29s flew almost exclusively at night.
With the end of the Korean War, the Air Force quickly purged the B-29 from its remaining frontline units. Most were sold for scrap or used as bombing targets for the Navy at China Lake. Only a few exist today in museums, and only one is currently flying. For all its flaws, the B-29 performed one of the most difficult, grisly roles of any aircraft in World War II. Capable of flying farther than any other plane of its era, carrying a bomb load equal to what 2 or 3 B-17s could haul aloft, and flying faster than most of the fighters that sought to bring it down, the Superfortress carved a legendary reputation for itself over the flak-torn skies of the Japanese homeland.
In 1940, the situation changed dramatically. The defeat of France by Nazi Germany allowed Japan to occupy both French Indochina and Thailand. This latest move threatened American bases in the Philippines and the British bastion at Singapore. President Roosevelt knew it was time to act. He ordered all of Japan's assets in the U.S. frozen and immediate sanctions imposed. The sale of steel and scrap metal were suspended, as were all shipments of oil. A Japanese withdrawal from both Indochina and China were demanded.
The idea is to impose an embargo on Japan, hopefully using the economic pressure to force the Japanese to withdraw from French Indochina. This is not a reasonable policy if you understand the problem the Japanese would have in saving face throughout Asia if they were to withdraw under the pressure of this economic embargo.
Rather than back down as the U.S. had hoped, the Japanese determined that they would seize the resources they needed to continue their expansion. Japan's principal aim was the conquest of the Dutch East Indies, Malaya, the Philippines, and Burma. Once these regions were taken, a defensive perimeter would be established stretching from the Kuriles Islands south through Wake, the Marianas, the Carolines, the Marshalls, and the Gilberts to Rabaul on New Britain. From Rabaul, the perimeter would extend westward to northwestern New Guinea and would encompass the Indies, Malaya, Thailand, and Burma. Japan believed that the Allies would wear themselves out in costly frontal assaults against the perimeter and would ultimately settle for a negotiated peace.
Like the French, who were unable to defend their overseas empire after being overrun and occupied by the Germans, the Netherlands have also been overrun and occupied by the Germans and are not in much of a situation to defend their overseas empire. The Japanese feel that this will be a fairly easy acquisition, just as French Indochina was. There's only one problem, and that is the lines of communications between the Dutch East Indies and Japan have to pass right by the Philippines, which are dominated by the United States. So if you're going to seize the Dutch East Indies and the oil that is available there, which is very critical to the continued operation of both the Japanese industrial plant and the Japanese military, they have to be able to bring about a situation where they can move through the Philippines without interference.
By the end of 1944, U.S. troops had recaptured most of the territory taken by the Japanese in 1941 and 1942. The invasion of Iwo Jima, which became an important objective in American plans to bring the Pacific Campaign to a conclusion, marked the first American landing on Japanese soil. How was it that Japan and the United States ever came to fight for that forsaken piece of real estate? What were the forces that had pushed these two countries toward this penultimate showdown? The governments of the United States and the Empire of Japan had expected to eventually clash in the Pacific. Both had been maturing plans for such a war for a long time. The crux of the matter was China. Both countries wanted to have a dominant position to exploit the resources of China and use it as a market. The war with Spain in 1890 had left the United States with a strong position, holding the Philippines, Guam, Wake, and other island possessions to protect its access to China's markets. Japan, which had only emerged as a strong power in 1905 when it defeated the Russian Empire in a limited war, had taken Korea, Formosa, and established a strong position from which to potentially dominate China.
The desire to maintain the open door policy with China was a driving factor in the United States obtaining possession of the Philippines, and the possession of the Philippines in turn gave us a place we had to defend, and it was this mission which drove the doctrine of the United States Navy and the Marine Corps between World War I and World War II.
The 1930s had seen greatly accelerated Japanese expansion. In fact, many people date the beginning of World War II to the Japanese seizure of Manchuria that began in 1931.
What happened is when the Japanese expanded Manchuria into Manchukuo in 1931, the United States refused to recognize this. However, it wasn't until 1940 that the U.S. did anything about it. It was diplomacy without any sanctions, economic, let alone military.
From the Americans.
To further show that he meant business, Roosevelt deployed the U.S. Pacific Fleet to Pearl Harbor, Hawaii early in 1940, where it would be closer to the strategic places America would need to defend in the event of war. Although conceived as a threat, the move instead presented the Japanese with an opportunity.
If they can neutralize the American Pacific Fleet, even for a period of time of no more than 6 months, that will allow them to complete their expansion in the Western Pacific Rim, to seize the Dutch East Indies, and to neutralize American resources in the Philippines. And of course then, the American people being a reasonable, rational people, we will then sit down and negotiate with the Japanese, who will be in a position of strength to resolve the outstanding issues in the Pacific.
Throughout their march to war, neither the United States nor Japan fully understood the consequences of their actions or the true capabilities of their opponent. The Americans believed that Japan was a backwards nation whose planes and ships were poor copies of foreign designs and whose soldiers, sailors, and airmen would be easy prey for the superior technology and manhood of the West. The Japanese saw it differently. Though they recognized the awesome industrial capacity of the United States, they saw America as a decadent civilization that would collapse when faced with the ferocity of Japan's mighty warriors.
What they're banking on is that war is essentially a spiritual exercise, courage and will to suffer. And that is supposed to be the Yankee playboy's weak suit. You know, once you have a mindset, it's difficult to change it.
It came to a crunch on December 7, 1941. American planning assumed an initial Japanese attack would fall on the Philippines. Army units there would dig in to hold the Bataan Peninsula until the mighty Pacific Fleet could sail to the rescue. But the Japanese had a plan too, which was revealed to the world on a lazy Sunday morning at Pearl Harbor.
There was this one group of airplanes came right over Honolulu. They dropped down to about 25 feet, right in the channel here towards a battleship. And Stanley Bukowski, who was one of my buddies, he was out there. He says, "Oh, let's go over there and watch them drop the dummy torpedoes." So him and I went over there. I said, "Well, I got first call for colors." He said, "I got sound colors here in about a couple of minutes."
And everywhere, the rising sun of Japan flew triumphantly. But the Japanese fell victim to their own success. Their spectacular victories, coupled with the surprising slap in the face from Jimmy Doolittle's daring raid on Tokyo, led to a modification of the initial plan. Japan would now reach further. Midway Island was to be invaded to neutralize Hawaii, and other forces would take the Solomon Islands and New Guinea to cut Australia's supply lines. If the Japanese could seize Midway Island, they would be in position to neutralize the American bases in Hawaii, and if the U.S. was forced to conduct the Pacific War from bases on the West Coast, it would be very hard to make a comeback.
It would have necessarily forced a prolongation of the war. I think it probably still would have been prolonged. I do not think that the public mood at that time would have fallen in line with the Japanese preference that we would have sued for peace in order to concentrate on Germany. But it certainly would have given Japan much, much more time to build up its defenses and make the road back through Tokyo longer and certainly bloodier.
Although the American fleet at Midway was heavily outnumbered, the U.S. possessed one invaluable advantage.
Admiral Nimitz's problem was considerably simplified in that Commander Rochefort's code breakers were able to tell him not only when and where the Japanese were going to strike next, specifically at Midway at dawn on June 4th, and it also gave the composition of the Japanese strike force. So the amount and detail of information available to the U.S. Pacific Fleet was simply phenomenal, and Japan, by contrast, was operating largely in the blind.
Through a combination of surprise and some amazing luck, American dive bombers sunk 4 Japanese carriers, dealing the Imperial Navy a blow from which it would never fully recover. After Midway, the initiative passed the United States. Two months later, Marines of the 1st Division launched America's first offensive of World War II in the Solomon Islands. The Japanese had earlier begun construction of an airfield on Guadalcanal that would threaten Allied communications to Australia. Wishing to build on the success of Midway, the decision was made to counterattack. A desperate struggle followed.
The Japanese were determined that the American lodgment on Guadalcanal would not stand. In fact, if you understand the plight of the folks at Henderson Field, in a single day they could be bombed by Japanese.
He said, "Oh, we'll make it, don't worry. We said, let them drop the first torpedoes and then we'll sound general quarters and colors." So we went over there, and then there was 5 of them. 2 looked like they were headed for the Oklahoma, and 3 for the West Virginia. So when they dropped their torpedoes, and then the torpedoes hit, and they were about 25 feet above the water when they dropped the torpedoes, and then you could see the little wake coming towards the ship, and Stanley says, "Look now, watch them when they hit, they're going to go thump." That was the first mistake we made that morning. When those 3 torpedoes hit, it blew Stanley and I across the ship to the starboard side. We're 118 feet wide. We were covered with oil, didn't know what in the world to think. And Stanley says, "Them buggers were using live torpedoes, which are not supposed to." And then as they climbed, then we looked at the airplane. Then as they got over the ship, then we could see the 2 red balls, but we still didn't grasp they were Japanese. And finally, it could have been about a minute or 2 later, our first sergeant came up soaking wet because his office was on 3rd deck, see, on the port side. It blew him completely out of his office. And he come up here and says, "Get to your battle station." He says, "We're under attack by the Japs."
The 2 attack waves of Japanese aircraft, totaling about 380-some planes, had they launched one more strike, it's arguable that the Pacific War would have been prolonged perhaps as much as 8 to 10, maybe 12 months more. But Nagumo had accomplished his primary mission. He had disabled every American battleship that was in Pearl Harbor. He had inflicted widespread damage on Army and Naval Air Forces, and he was willing to call that good enough. But the big break that the United States Pacific Fleet had was that all 3 of its carriers were out of port that day. So that was a huge stroke of luck, which paid enormous dividends within the next 6 months.
The devastating raid on Pearl Harbor, coupled with attacks on airfields in the Philippines, enabled Japan to seize the initiative in the Pacific. The weak Allied naval and air forces were smashed or brushed aside, and within weeks, Singapore and the Philippines fell, yielding hundreds of thousands of American, British, Australian, and Indian prisoners. The Dutch East Indies, Guam, and Wake were taken,